I was the golden girl of the science department, dating the smartest boy on campus. We had a perfect future planned. But then I met the captain of the football team, a man who couldn't solve a basic equation but knew exactly how to break me. He didn't want tutoring, he wanted ownership. When he failed his classes, he blackmailed me into stealing the final exam. I had a choice: ruin my own life or destroy the innocent boyfriend who trusted me. I chose survival. I framed the man I loved, watched his life burn, and then walked straight back into the arms of the monster who made me do it. The university library was more than just a building to me. It was a sanctuary constructed of silence and stone, a cathedral where the scent of decaying paper and binding glue acted as a balm to my frayed nerves. I sat at our usual table in the back corner, surrounded by the hushed reverence of students bowing before the altar of knowledge. Across from me sat Kevin, the center of my safe, predictable universe, fortified behind a wall of textbooks on quantum physics. He was the perfect specimen of our academic environment, a creature evolved for the quiet pursuit of abstract truths rather than the chaotic struggle of the physical world. Kevin's skin was pale, untouched by the harsh sun of the football field, and his hands were the delicate tools of a scholar, his long fingers dancing across his calculator with the precision of a surgeon. We were the department's golden couple, our future mapped out on a timeline that extended years into the distance with comforting certainty: graduate school, doctoral theses, tenure tracks, and a quiet life in the suburbs. He looked up at me, adjusting his glasses with a nervous tick I found endearing, and mouthed the words, "I love you," wrapping me in a blanket of security I thought was unbreakable. But this fragile idol was shattered in an instant by the violent boom of the double doors being thrown open against the far wall, a sound that echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. The silence of the library was not just broken, it was murdered. The dean of students strode in, looking harried and small, but it was the figure trailing in his wake that sucked the oxygen out of the room. It was Tyrone, the captain of the university's football team, a local celebrity whose name was chanted by thousands on Saturdays and cursed by the faculty on Mondays. He was a mountain of a man, a physical anomaly that seemed to defy the biological laws Kevin studied so diligently. Clad in a tight athletic tracksuit that did little to hide the sheer density of his frame, he moved with a rolling, predatory gait that suggested he was too large for the indoors. His skin was the color of deep obsidian, glistening slightly under the fluorescent lights, and his neck seemed wider than Kevin's entire head. He walked with the easy, terrifying confidence of an apex predator who knows he has wandered into a pen of sheep, his presence vibrating with a raw energy. The dean navigated the maze of tables with frantic energy, leading the giant straight to us as if we were the destination of a desperate pilgrimage. He stopped at our table, placing a heavy, damp hand on my shoulder. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that carried the weight of institutional panic. He explained that Tyrone's athletic scholarship, and by extension, the university's hopes for a championship title, was hanging by a thread due to his catastrophic failure in remedial mathematics. He told me that I, as the top student in the course, was not just a tutor, but their last hope. Tyrone did not look at the dean. He did not seem to care about the man pleading his case or the academic emergency that had brought him to this temple of silence. Instead, he looked at me. His gaze was heavy, tangible, and devoid of the polite deference I was used to from the boys in my classes. He looked me up and down with a slow, assessing insolence, his eyes lingering on my mouth and my neck. In that dark, unblinking stare, I saw no plea for help with linear equations, nor did I see any respect for the sanctuary of the library. I saw a challenge, a promise of something chaotic and dangerous that made my palms sweat and turned the cozy, safe world of the library into a flimsy cardboard set. I looked at Kevin, still tapping on his calculator, oblivious to the predator standing inches away, and then back at Tyrone. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, electric tension that had nothing to do with academics. I realized with a jolt of fear that the walls of my sanctuary had just been breached, and something wild had found its way inside. The original arrangement had been meticulously noted in my color-coded planner, a 1-hour session in the neutral, well-lit environment of the dormitory study hall, a place of public scrutiny and academic rigor. But the chaotic reality of Tyrone's life had intervened before we had even begun, appending my carefully structured schedule with a casual disregard that I found both irritating and strangely compelling. He had texted me 5 minutes before our meeting time, a brief, grammatically devoid message claiming he had left his necessary materials in his room and suggesting I just come there instead to save time. I stood before the door to room 304, my hand hovering over the wood, feeling a tremor of hesitation that had nothing to do with the academic task at hand and everything to do with the threshold I was about to cross. The hallway of the athletic dorms felt like a different planet compared to the quiet, sterile corridors of the science building. It vibrated with a low-frequency thrum of bass music bleeding through the walls and the shouting of young men that sounded more like combat than conversation. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my pleated skirt in a nervous, reflexive gesture, and knocked, the sound sharp and authoritative against the heavy grain of the door. When the door swung open, the first thing that hit me was the wall of scent, a complex and heavy atmosphere that instantly overwhelmed the memory of the antiseptic laboratories where I spent my days. It was not the smell of chemicals or old paper, it was a thick, biological cocktail of expensive, spicy cologne masking the underlying notes of sweat, worn leather, and a deep, earthy musk that was aggressively masculine. It was the smell of exertion and testosterone, a sensory assault that made my head swim and my pulse quicken before I had even taken a single step inside. I stepped over the threshold, clutching my bag of textbooks to my chest like a shield, and the door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the hallway and enclosing us in his private sanctuary. The room was a testament to physical achievement, a chaotic shrine to the body and its capabilities, utterly devoid of the intellectual clutter that defined Kevin's existence. There were no stacks of journals or complex diagrams on the walls. Instead, every surface was piled high with the tools of his trade, shoulder pads that looked like armor, helmets with scratched visors, and cleats caked with the drying mud of the practice field. Golden trophies and commemorative game balls lined the shelves, gleaming in the afternoon light that filtered through the half-closed blinds, proof of his dominance in a world I barely understood. Tyrone was waiting for me, not at the small desk that was buried under a pile of sports magazines, but on the bed. He was sprawled across the mattress with a careless, leonine grace, his massive frame taking up so much space that the twin-sized bed looked like a toy beneath him. He wore a sleeveless jersey that exposed the corded muscles of his arms, his skin the color of midnight, absorbing the dim light of the room. He looked up as I navigated through the obstacle course of his gear, a lazy smile playing on his lips that did not reach his eyes, which remained watchful and heavy. He was twirling a yellow pencil in his fingers, the wood looking absurdly fragile against the dark, calloused expanse of his hand, like a matchstick he could snap without a second thought. "You made it," he rumbled, his voice a baritone vibration that I felt in the floorboards rather than heard with my ears. He did not sit up, he did not clear a space for me. I moved a chair from the desk, clearing off a pile of towels, and sat down at a safe distance, creating a barrier of air and decorum between us. I opened the textbook to the chapter on linear algebra, my movements precise and jerky, trying to impose order on a situation that felt increasingly volatile. "We have 45 minutes, Tyrone," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the heavy air of the room. "The dean said your grasp of vector spaces is non-existent. We need to start with the basics if you want to pass Friday's test." He stopped twirling the pencil and let it drop onto the sheets, the small sound magnified by the sudden silence between us. He didn't look at the book, he didn't look at the equations I had written out on the notepad. He looked at me. His gaze started at my face, traveled down the line of my neck, and settled with heavy, unashamed weight on my legs, which were crossed at the ankle. It was a look of consumption, a look that stripped away the layers of my academic persona and saw only the flesh beneath. I cleared my throat, a nervous, sharp sound meant to recall his attention to the abstract world of numbers, but he ignored it completely. "Are you listening to me?" I asked, trying to channel the authority of a professor, though I knew I was failing. "This isn't a joke. If you don't understand these concepts, you cannot play on Saturday. The scholarship committee is looking for a reason to cut funding, and you are giving them one on a silver platter." He finally shifted, swinging his legs over the side of the bed so that he was facing me, his knees only inches from mine. The proximity was alarming. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace stoked by a metabolism that burned hotter and faster than anyone I knew. "I hear you," he said, his voice slow and dripping with a lack of concern that bordered on arrogance. I just don't care about the numbers, little genius. I never have. You have to care, I insisted, tapping the open page with my pen, desperate to drag the conversation back to safe ground. Mathematics is the foundation of everything. It's logic. It's structure. I was babbling, reciting the mantras Kevin and I lived by, trying to use logic as a weapon against a force of nature. Without this, you have no future at this university. Do you want to go back to where you came from? Do you want to lose everything because you refuse to learn how to calculate a determinant? Tyrone chuckled, a low, dark sound that rumbled in his chest, and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement brought his face level with mine, invading my personal space with a terrifying ease. You think this, he pointed a thick finger at the book, is power? You think scribbling on paper makes you strong? His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the intelligence lurking there, not academic, but primal, cunning, and incredibly dangerous. I know what power is, he whispered, the scent of musk and mint on his breath washing over me. Power isn't asking for permission to solve a problem. Power is taking what you want because no one is strong enough to stop you. He reached out, not to take the book, but to place his hand on the back of my chair, boxing me in without even touching me. You come in here with your little rules and your little voice, thinking you can teach me. But you're the one shaking. I looked down at my hands and realized he was right. They were trembling, the pen shaking against the paper. I was reacting to him on a level that bypassed my intellect entirely, a biological response to a superior predator. I should go, I said, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. Kevin is waiting for me. We have a reservation at the cafeteria. If you aren't going to take this seriously, I can't help you. I made a move to stand up, to gather my books and flee back to the safety of the library and my gentle, predictable boyfriend. Logic dictated that I leave immediately, that I report his insolence to the dean, that I wash my hands of this impossible student. But my body did not obey the command. My legs felt heavy, anchored to the floor by a strange, paralyzing mixture of fear and a dark, liquid heat that was pooling in my stomach. Tyrone stood up then, unfolding his full height, and the room seemed to shrink instantly, the ceiling suddenly too low, the walls too close. He loomed over me, a monolith of muscle and shadow, blocking out the light from the window. I was forced to crane my neck to look up at him, emphasizing the disparity in our size, the absolute vulnerability of my position. He did not move to stop me, yet I remained frozen, trapped by the gravity of his presence. Kevin, he said the name with a sneer, tasting it like something spoiled. The boy who counts on his fingers. He took a step closer, his shins brushing against my knees, forcing me to press back into the hard plastic of the chair. Does he make you shake like this? Does he make your heart hammer against your ribs so hard I can see it through your shirt? He reached out a hand, and I flinched, expecting violence, but his touch was shockingly light. His fingers brushed against my cheek, rough skin against smooth, a contrast that sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. He traced the line of my jaw, his thumb resting near the corner of my mouth. You aren't scared of failing a test, he murmured, his eyes darkening, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the iris. You're scared because you realize that all those books can't protect you from this. From what's real. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was pleading for him to stop, or for him to continue. The air in the room was stifling, hot and thick, making it hard to breathe. I have to go. It was a lie. I didn't have to go. I didn't want to go. The realization horrified me. I was the good girl, the scholar, the faithful girlfriend, yet here I was, mesmerized by the very thing I was supposed to be above. No, he said simply, a command that brokered no argument. You don't. He moved his hand up, his fingers sliding into the hair at my temple, gripping gently but firmly. With his other hand, he reached toward my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm, waiting. I felt his fingers brush the bridge of my nose, finding the frame of my glasses. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted them from my face. The world instantly dissolved into a soft, impressionistic blur. The sharp edges of the trophies, the titles on the books, the details of the room, all of it vanished, leaving only the dark, looming shape of Tyrone standing before me. By taking my sight, he had stripped me of my last defense, my ability to analyze and categorize my surroundings. I was blind, vulnerable, and entirely in his power. He tossed the glasses onto the desk, the clatter of the plastic frames hitting the wood sounding like a gavel ending a trial. "You don't need to see the equations," he whispered, his voice dropping to a rough growl that vibrated against my skin. "You just need to feel." He stepped in between my knees, his thighs parting mine with an arrogant assumption of access, and I realized with a terrified thrill that the lesson was over, and the real education was about to begin. I looked up into the blur of his face, unable to see his expression clearly, only feeling the waves of heat and dominance rolling off him. The image of Kevin waiting in the cafeteria, checking his watch, checking his phone, flashed through my mind, a small, distant beacon of safety that was rapidly disappearing into the fog. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a dark, turbulent ocean, and instead of stepping back, I felt my body leaning forward, drawn by the abyss. "Forget the math," Tyrone said, his hands moving to my waist, his grip heavy and possessive, lifting me slightly in the chair. "Let me show you what you've been missing while you were burying your nose in those books." And as his mouth descended toward mine, blocking out the last of the light, I knew that no amount of calculus could solve the problem of what I was about to do. The variable had changed, and the solution was no longer rational. The pretense of academic instruction evaporated within the first week, dissolving like sugar in hot water until only the raw, granulated reality of our arrangement remained. The scheduled tutoring sessions, duly recorded in the university's official ledger as remedial mathematics support, became a hollow farce, a bureaucratic cover for a descent into a world that had nothing to do with numbers. I would arrive at his dormitory door 3 times a week, clutching my binder of notes and practice tests like a talisman against the chaos I was about to enter, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the binder was tossed onto the floor, unopened and ignored. Tyrone had deciphered my nature with a speed and accuracy that would have baffled my psychology professors, bypassing my intellectual defenses to locate the bored, desperate creature hiding beneath the cardigan and the glasses. He understood, with an instinct born of the streets rather than the classroom, that I was not merely a tutor fulfilling a scholarship obligation. He saw that I was a woman suffocating under the weight of her own perfect, privileged existence, a good girl who was secretly starving for a taste of the bad, and he was more than willing to feed me. He did not ask for my affection, nor did he court me with the clumsy, earnest gestures I was accustomed to from boys of my own social standing. He simply took. There was no negotiation, no preamble about his day or mine, there was only the immediate, overwhelming assertion of his physical will. While Kevin was likely sitting in the front row of a lecture hall, politely raising his hand to correct a professor's equation on the chalkboard, I was pinned against the rough plaster of a dorm room wall, my feet dangling inches off the floor. The dynamic in that room was an utter inversion of the world outside. In the library, I was the master, the one with the answers, the one who held the keys to his future. But in the stifling, musk-scented air of room 304, I was nothing more than a vessel for his aggression, a soft place for him to land after the violence of the field. He used me to purge the stress of the game, to vent the pressure of the scouts and the coaches, and I allowed it, rationalizing my submission with the flimsy lie that I was helping the star player maintain his focus. My phone would often vibrate in the pocket of my discarded skirt, a persistent, insect-like buzzing that signaled a message from the life I had left behind in the daylight. It was invariably Kevin, sending sweet, thoughtful updates about our evening plans or a funny observation about a quantum mechanics paradox. "Saved us seats near the front," he would write, or, "thinking of you. Hope the tutoring isn't too painful." The irony of his words, glowing on the screen in the dim light, was a sharp, twisted knife that only heightened the sensation of my betrayal. I would read these messages later, my hair disheveled and my lips swollen, and feel a surge of guilt that was quickly swallowed by a dark, shameful thrill. While Kevin was securing our future with his mind, preserving our spot in the intellectual elite, I was learning an anatomy lesson that no textbook could teach. I was learning the topography of a body built for impact, exploring the density of muscle and the heat of skin that was miles away from the soft, pale embrace I went home to. The intimacy with Tyrone, if it could even be called that, was rude, greedy, and entirely devoid of the tender, reverent lovemaking I experienced with Kevin. Kevin treated my body like a rare manuscript, something to be handled with white gloves and turned with care. Tyrone treated me like a piece of equipment, something durable and necessary, designed to withstand force. He did not care if I finished, he did not whisper endearments. He groaned, he sweated, and he took what he needed with a single-minded focus that was terrifying in its intensity. I began to realize, with a clarity that shook the foundations of my worldview, the vast, unbridgeable chasm between intellectual power and primal might. Kevin possessed a mind that could unravel the mysteries of the universe, a brain that could calculate the trajectory of a star or the binding energy of an atom. He was the pinnacle of human evolution, the triumph of the cerebral cortex over the lizard brain. But in the enclosed space of a dorm room, facing a man like Tyrone, Kevin's equations were utterly useless. Tyrone could not recite the multiplication table without stumbling. He struggled to comprehend the most basic concepts of algebra, staring at the numbers with a dull, angry confusion. Yet, he possessed a power that was ancient and undeniable. He could lift me with one arm, effortless as breathing. He could pin me to the mattress with the weight of his thigh, rendering me immobile and helpless. His power was immediate, kinetic, and undeniable. It did not require a degree to understand, it only required a nervous system to feel. I became addicted to this contrast, a junkie seeking the fix of her own powerlessness. I craved the feeling of being small, of being overwhelmed, of having my agency stripped away by a force of nature. It was a vacation from the exhausting responsibility of being the smart one, the leader, the girl with the plan. With Tyrone, I didn't have to think, I just had to endure and react. I was the prey, and for a woman who had spent her life being the hunter of grades and accolades, the surrender was intoxicating. My dual existence began to fracture my psyche, splitting me into two distinct entities that shared a single body. By day, I was the star student, the girl in the front row with the perfectly highlighted notes, discussing the nuances of string theory and planning a wedding in the Hamptons. I walked the campus with my head held high, my arm linked through Kevin's, accepting the admiring glances of the faculty who saw us as the future of the department. By night, or rather, in those stolen, sweat-drenched hours of the late afternoon, I became something else entirely. I became a toy for a boy from the ghetto, a willing participant in a sordid, secret game. I let a man who probably couldn't spell hypothesis use me in ways that would have made my mother faint and my boyfriend vomit. I degraded myself for the thrill of his touch, for the sheer, animalistic pleasure of being wanted not for my mind, but for my flesh. Tyrone seemed to relish this corruption, treating my body with a possessive arrogance that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. He would often make comments about your little boyfriend, mocking Kevin's fragility, his glasses, his books. He would ask if Kevin could do this, or if Kevin could make me scream like that, and I would shake my head, breathless and ashamed, feeding his ego with my betrayal. He was conquering the smart guy by conquering his girl, a primitive victory that he savored. The tutoring sessions became a dangerous routine, a ticking clock that I ignored. I stopped trying to teach him math entirely. Instead, I did his homework for him. I would sit at his desk, naked save for one of his oversized jerseys, and solve the linear equations and probability sets with rapid efficiency, forging his handwriting as best I could. It was academic fraud, a violation of the honor code I held dear, but it was the price of admission to his bed. I justified it to myself as a necessary evil, a way to keep him in school so I could keep seeing him. If he failed, he would be expelled, sent back to the violent, hopeless neighborhood he had escaped, and I would be left alone with my books and my boring, safe life. I was saving him, I told myself. I was keeping the team's star player eligible. But deep down, I knew I wasn't saving him, I was buying him. I was paying for his body with my brain, a transaction as old as time. Occasionally, guilt would pierce through the fog of lust, sharp and sudden. I would be lying next to Kevin in his twin bed, listening to his gentle breathing, feeling the safe, familiar warmth of his skin, and I would remember the bruise Tyrone had left on my hip, or the way he had pulled my hair. I would feel like a monster, a parasite hollowed out by deceit. I would vow to stop, to end it, to focus on the man who actually loved me. But then I would see Tyrone in the hallway, towering over the other students, moving with that lazy, dangerous grace. He would catch my eye, just for a second, and give a subtle nod or a smirk, a silent reminder of what we had done and what we would do again. And the resolve would crumble, replaced by a liquid heat in my belly and a desperate need to be back in that smelly, messy room, under the weight of his indifference. The contrast between the two men became the defining feature of my reality. Kevin was the mind, Tyrone was the body. Kevin was the future, Tyrone was the now. Kevin was safety, Tyrone was danger. And I, the girl who was supposed to be smart enough to know better, found myself unable to choose the light over the dark. I wanted both. I wanted the respectability of the day and the depravity of the night. One afternoon, Tyrone was particularly aggressive, his mood foul after a bad practice. He didn't even wait for me to put my bag down before he pushed me against the door. It was rougher than usual, bordering on painful, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of genuine fear. I tried to push him back, to tell him to slow down, but he laughed, a harsh sound against my ear. "You like it," he whispered. "Don't lie. You like knowing I could break you." And the horror was, he was right. I didn't push him away. I stopped fighting and let him take what he wanted, my mind shutting down, retreating to a place where I didn't have to analyze the morality of my actions. I was an object, a thing to be used, and in that moment, the freedom from expectation was the greatest high of all. I was no longer the genius, I was just a body. As the semester wore on, the stakes grew higher. The final exam was approaching, a hurdle that I could not jump for him. He had to take the test himself, in a proctored room, without me there to whisper the answers or guide his hand. The realization that our arrangement was reaching a critical failure point began to dawn on me. My tutoring had been a lie, he had learned nothing. He was going to fail, and his failure would expose everything. I tried to bring it up one evening, after we were finished, as I was pulling on my socks. "Tyrone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The final is in 2 weeks. It's 50% of the grade. You can't fake this one." He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. He didn't look at me. "You'll figure something out," he said dismissively. "You always do. You're the smart one, right?" "I can't take the test for you," I insisted, panic rising in my throat. "They check IDs. It's in the main lecture hall. You have to know the material." He turned his head slowly, fixing me with that cold, predatory stare that made my blood run cold. "I said," he repeated, his voice low and menacing, "you'll figure something out. Unless you want everyone to know what the smart girl has been doing in the dark." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the first time he had explicitly weaponized our affair against me. Before, the secrecy had been mutual, a shared protection. Now, it was a leash. He knew that I had more to lose than he did. He was a football star, a scandal might even enhance his reputation in some circles. But me? I would be ruined. My academic standing, my relationship with Kevin, my reputation, it would all be incinerated. I walked back to my own dorm that evening in a daze, the cool night air doing nothing to clear the fog of terror in my mind. I had thought I was the one in control, the one bestowing favors, the one using him. But as I looked at the lighted windows of the library, where Kevin was undoubtedly waiting for me, I realized the terrifying truth. I wasn't the user. I was the used. And the bill for my pleasure was about to come due. The specter of the final examination hung over the campus like a leaden cloud, a palpable atmospheric pressure that seemed to suck the joy out of the spring air and replace it with the frantic, caffeinated hum of desperation. For Tyrone, however, the pressure did not manifest as late-night study sessions or panic attacks over flashcards. It manifested as a dark, volatile rage that simmered just beneath the surface of his skin. The date of the test was approaching with the relentless inevitability of a freight train, and despite the weeks we had spent together in that suffocating room, his understanding of linear algebra remained as non-existent as it had been on day one. He had learned the curves of my body, the sounds I made when I was breathless, and the precise amount of force required to make me submit, but he could not solve for X to save his life. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate the thick armor of his arrogance, and it was making him dangerous in a way I had not anticipated. I arrived at his room on a Tuesday afternoon, the air in the hallway thick with humidity and the smell of floor wax. When I entered, I expected the usual routine, the heavy look, the discarded books, the immediate physical claim. But the atmosphere in the room was different today. It was charged with a static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. Tyrone was pacing the small floor space, his movements jerky and agitated, like a tiger realizing the door to his cage has been welded shut. The room was a disaster area of crumpled papers and broken pencils, evidence of a rare and frustrated attempt to actually engage with the material. He stopped when he saw me, his chest heaving, and the look he gave me was not one of desire, but of pure, unadulterated loathing. "It's gibberish," he spat, kicking a textbook across the room where it hit the wall with a dull thud. "None of it makes sense. They're trying to fail me. They want me gone." I stood by the door, clutching my bag, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. This was not the lazy, confident predator I was used to, this was a cornered animal, and I was the only other living thing in the enclosure. "We can go over the practice problems again," I suggested, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound calm. "If you just focus on the patterns, Tyrone, you can pass. You don't need an A. You just need a D." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that lacked any humor. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. He did not reach for my waist or my hair. He did not push me toward the bed. Instead, his hand shot out and wrapped around my throat. It was not a caress, and it was not the rough foreplay we had established as our norm. It was a threat. He didn't squeeze hard enough to crush my windpipe, but the pressure was firm, absolute, and undeniable. He pinned me against the door, lifting me slightly onto my toes, forcing me to look up into eyes that were burning with a cold, calculated fury. "I don't need a D," he hissed, his face inches from mine, spittle flying from his lips. "I need to stay on the team. I need that contract. If I get cut, I go back to nothing. Do you understand what nothing is, rich girl? It's a hole you never climb out of." The heat of his hand on my neck was searing, a brand of ownership that felt fundamentally different from anything that had come before. He was not using me for pleasure now, he was using me as a leverage point, a tool to pry open the jaws of the trap he was in. "I am not going back," he whispered, the words vibrating against my skin. "And you are going to make sure of that." I clawed at his wrist, my nails digging into his skin, but his grip was like iron. "I can't take the test for you," I gasped, the air struggling to reach my lungs. "I told you. I can't." He leaned in closer, his weight pressing me into the wood of the door until my spine ached. "You're smart," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly conversational tone. "You'll figure it out. Because if you don't, if I fail that test and lose my scholarship, I'm taking you down with me." He released my throat abruptly, letting me drop back onto my heels. I gasped, coughing, my hand flying to my neck to massage the tender skin. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his massive chest, and looked at me with a smug, triumphant expression. "You think I'm just some dumb jock you can play with and then throw away?" he asked, shaking his head slowly. "I know what you are. You're a tourist. You come here to get dirty, then you run back to your little boyfriend and pretend you're clean." Then he dropped the bomb that shattered my world completely. He walked over to his desk and picked up his phone, tapping the screen with a deliberate slowness. He turned it around and held it up for me to see. On the small, glowing screen was a video. It was grainy and dark, filmed from a discreet angle on the bookshelf, but the image was unmistakable. It was me. It was us. The sounds coming from the tiny speaker, my voice, begging, moaning, filled the silence of the room like a toxic gas. "I kept receipts," he said, his smile widening as he saw the blood drain from my face. Every lesson. Every time you came here and got on your knees instead of opening a book. He lowered the phone, tapping it against his palm. If I get kicked out, this video goes to Kevin. It goes to the dean. It goes to your parents. Everyone will see exactly what the valedictorian is really good at. The horror that washed over me was total and paralyzing. It was a physical blow, a nausea that rose in my throat and threatened to choke me. My perfect facade, the carefully curated reputation I had built over years of straight-as and polite smiles, the future I had planned with Kevin, all of it was hanging by a thread, and Tyrone held the scissors. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized my fatal error. I had underestimated him. I had viewed him through the lens of my own prejudice, seeing only a body, a brute force. But he was a manipulator of the highest order, a survivor who had identified my weakness and exploited it with a ruthless efficiency that rivaled any grandmaster. You wouldn't, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It would ruin you too. He shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference. I'm already ruined if I fail, he said. I got nothing to lose. You got everything. So you better start thinking, genius. How am I going to pass that test? He tossed the phone onto the bed and turned his back on me, dismissing me as if I were a servant he had finished giving orders to. Get out, he said. And don't come back until you have a solution. I fled the room, stumbling down the hallway with tears blinding my eyes, the sound of his laughter echoing in my ears. The walk across campus was a blur of panic and despair. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the quad that seemed to reach out and grab at my ankles. I felt dirty, contaminated, not just by the affair, but by the sheer stupidity of my own actions. I had walked willingly into a trap, blinded by lust and arrogance, and now the jaws had snapped shut. I found myself standing in front of the library, drawn there by a homing instinct I couldn't control. Kevin was waiting for me in the lobby, holding 2 cups of tea. When he saw me, his face crumpled in concern. He rushed over, abandoning the cups on a nearby table, and wrapped me in a hug that felt safe and warm and terrifyingly fragile. Hey, what's wrong? He asked, pulling back to look at my face. You're shaking. You look pale as a sheet. I buried my face in his chest, inhaling the scent of soap and old wool, the smell of innocence. I'm just tired, I lied, the falsehood tasting like ash in my mouth. The pressure, the tutoring, it's too much. He's impossible. Kevin stroked my hair, his touch gentle and soothing, completely unaware that he was holding a woman who had just come from the bed of the man who was threatening to destroy him. I know, babe, he murmured. It's okay. You're doing your best. Don't let him get to you. He led me to a quiet corner of the cafeteria, sitting me down and placing a fresh cup of tea in my hands. He started talking about his day, about the chaos of grading papers for the freshman seminar, trying to distract me with the mundane details of our shared academic life. Professor Miller is a nightmare, he laughed, adjusting his glasses. He changed the combination to the department safe again because he's paranoid someone is going to steal the midterm. Like anyone cares that much about intro to physics. The word safe cut through the fog of my panic like a beacon. I looked up at him, my eyes focusing on his face for the first time. The safe? I asked, my voice steadying. The one in the main office? Kevin nodded, oblivious to the gears that had just started turning in my head. Yeah. He gave the new code to the TAs this morning. It's ridiculous. He thinks he's guarding the nuclear launch codes. He kept talking, but I stopped listening. My gaze dropped to his backpack, which was sitting on the floor between us. I knew what was inside. I knew that in the front pocket, on a ring with a little plastic molecule keychain, were the keys to the faculty offices. And in his head, accessible and trusting, was the code to the safe where the final exams were stored before distribution. The solution to my problem was sitting right in front of me, wrapped in a cardigan and smiling with love. The realization made me feel sick, a deep, rotting sensation in my gut. To save myself, to save my reputation and my future, would have to destroy him. If the exam was stolen, Kevin, as the TA with the keys and the code, would be the prime suspect. He would be blamed. His academic career, the one he had worked so hard for, the one that defined him, would be over. Tyrone would get his grade, would get my silence, and Kevin would be the collateral damage. I looked at his face, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the cafeteria. He was talking about our summer plans, about a trip to the coast, about a future that I was about to incinerate. He trusted me completely. He loved me. And I was going to sacrifice him on the altar of my own vanity and fear. The choice was stark and brutal: confess and be ruined, or betray him and survive. Kevin, I said, interrupting him. Can I borrow your keys? I left my charger in the lab, and I don't want to walk all the way to security to get let in. It was a lie so smooth it terrified me. Kevin didn't hesitate. He didn't even blink. Of course, he said, reaching into his bag. The jingle of the keys as he pulled them out sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell. He handed them to me, the metal warm from his pocket. Do you want me to come with you? He asked, ever the gentleman, ever the protector. No, I said quickly, standing up and clutching the keys in my fist so tight the edges bit into my palm. No, stay here. Finish your tea. I'll be right back. I leaned down and kissed him on the forehead, a Judas kiss if there ever was one. I love you, I whispered, and the words felt like a curse. I walked away from him, moving toward the exit, toward the science building, toward the crime I was about to commit. I could feel his eyes on my back, watching me with affection, waiting for my return. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was walking into the dark, driven by a survival instinct that was as primal and ruthless as the man who had awakened it. I was no longer the girl in the library. I was a thief, a liar, and a traitor, and I was about to prove that I belonged in Tyrone's world far more than I belonged in Kevin's. The night before the final examination did not descend upon the campus with the peaceful silence of slumber. Rather, it arrived like a heavy, suffocating shroud that muffled the world and amplified the chaotic thumping of my own heart. I lay awake in the narrow twin bed of Kevin's dormitory room, staring up at the water stains on the acoustic ceiling tiles, listening to the rhythmic, trusting cadence of his breathing just a few feet away. The digital clock on his desk glowed with a malevolent red light, marking the passage of time in agonizing minutes. 2 o'clock, 2:15, 2:30, each shift of the numbers bringing me closer to the moment of my irrevocable damnation. Kevin was deeply asleep, exhausted from a week of honest, diligent study, his arm thrown over his eyes as if to shield himself from the harsh realities of the world, completely unaware that the woman lying next to him was plotting his destruction. The air in the room was stale and warm, recycling the heat of the day, but I felt a bone-deep chill that no amount of blankets could dispel. I was shivering from the inside out, my nervous system misfiring with a cocktail of adrenaline and nausea. I turned my head slowly on the pillow, the fabric rustling like dry leaves in the quiet room, and looked at his backpack. It was sitting on the floor near the door, a shapeless dark mound in the shadows, but to my eyes, it radiated a gravitational pull as strong as a black hole. Inside that bag, nestled among highlighters and graph paper, lay the brass keys that opened the doors to the science department, and more importantly, the office of Professor Miller. I waited until the clock flickered to 3 in the morning, the hour of the wolf, when the human spirit is at its weakest and the shadows are at their longest. I slid out from under the covers, moving with the exaggerated, fluid slowness of a mime, terrified that the friction of the sheets would sound like a siren. My feet touched the cold linoleum floor, and I winced, pausing to ensure that the rhythm of Kevin's breathing hadn't hitched. He shifted slightly, murmuring something unintelligible in his sleep, a formula, perhaps, or my name, and then settled back into the deep, restorative sleep of the innocent. I stood over him for a moment, a silhouette of betrayal, looking down at the face I had kissed 1,000 times, and felt a tear slide hot and stinging down my cheek. I crept across the small room, navigating the obstacle course of discarded clothes and books by memory, until I reached the backpack. I knelt down, the hard floor biting into my knees, and slowly unzipped the front pocket. The sound of the zipper teeth parting was a scream in the silence, a jagged, tearing noise that made my heart stop. I froze, my eyes darting to the bed, but Kevin didn't move. I reached inside, my fingers brushing against loose change and gum wrappers before closing around the cold, jagged metal of the key ring. I pulled them out, clutching them tight in my fist to prevent them from jingling, the metal edges digging into my palm like an accusation. Dressing was a frantic, fumbling affair in the dark. I pulled on black leggings and a dark hoodie, dressing for a burglary rather than a study session, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. I slipped my feet into my sneakers, leaving the laces untied to avoid the noise, and grabbed my phone. I took one last look at Kevin, a silent apology forming on my lips that I didn't have the courage to voice, and then slipped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the empty corridor, sealing my fate. I was no longer just a student or a girlfriend, I was a thief in the night, moving with a singular, desperate purpose. The walk across the campus was a journey through a surreal, alien landscape. The manicured lawns and brick buildings, so welcoming and collegiate by day, had been transformed by the darkness into a gothic labyrinth of shadows and looming shapes. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak trees with a sound that mimicked footsteps, making me spin around constantly, convinced that security was right behind me. I stuck to the unlit paths, avoiding the pools of yellow light cast by the street lamps, moving like a ghost through the institution that had once been my sanctuary. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very eyes of the statues of the founders were tracking my progress with judgment. The science building loomed ahead, a brutalist block of concrete and glass that looked like a fortress against the night sky. I approached the side entrance, the one used by the graduate students and faculty, my hands shaking so violently I could barely guide the key into the lock. I fumbled, the metal scratching against the plate, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. Finally, the tumblers clicked, a mechanical sound of surrender, and I pushed the heavy door open. The smell hit me immediately, that familiar mix of floor wax, formaldehyde, and ozone, but tonight it didn't smell like learning, it smelled like a crime scene. Inside, the building was a tomb. The long corridor stretched out into darkness, illuminated only by the red glow of the emergency exit signs. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, a low, industrial drone that vibrated in the walls. I walked quickly, my rubber soles squeaking faintly on the polished terrazzo, flinching at every shadow that stretched and warped as I passed. I felt like an intruder in my own life, trespassing in a place where I technically belonged but had forfeited the right to be. I reached the main faculty office, the frosted glass of the door glowing faintly from the streetlights outside. I used the second key on the ring, the smaller silver one, and unlocked the office door. I stepped inside and closed it softly behind me, plunging the room into semi-darkness. I didn't dare turn on the lights. A lit window at 3 in the morning would alert campus security immediately. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom like a laser. It swept over the desks, the stacks of papers, the potted plants, until it landed on the large, gray metal safe in the corner. It looked impregnable, a monolith of authority standing between Tyrone and his expulsion. I approached it, my legs feeling weak and watery. I knelt before the keypad, the numbers worn from years of use. I closed my eyes for a second, summoning the memory of Kevin's voice in the cafeteria, the casual, trusting way he had mentioned the new code. 1984 *. It was almost laughably simple, the year of his birth and a literary reference he loved. I punched the numbers in, my breath held in my throat. The keypad beeped softly with each press, a countdown to disaster. Beep. 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 There was a pause, a second of agonizing silence where I prayed for the red light of failure, for a reason to turn back. But the light flashed green, and a heavy mechanical clunk echoed from within the door. I pulled the handle, and the heavy steel swung open on silent hinges. Inside, neatly stacked on the middle shelf, were the manila envelopes containing the final exams for Linear Algebra 2. I grabbed the top folder, my hands trembling so bad I nearly dropped it. I opened it on Professor Miller's desk, spreading the white pages out in the beam of my flashlight. I worked with frantic, terrified efficiency. I snapped a photo of the first page, checked the clarity, then flipped to the next. Snap. Flip. Snap. Flip. The camera shutter sound on my phone was turned off, but in my head, it sounded like a guillotine blade falling over and over again. I was photographing the questions, the diagrams, the answer key that Miller had clipped to the back. I was stealing the intellectual property of the university, violating the honor code, and framing the person I loved, all to satisfy the demands of a man who barely knew my name. When I was finished, I shoved the papers back into the envelope, trying to arrange them exactly as they had been. I placed the folder back in the safe and closed the door, spinning the handle to lock it. I wiped the handle with the sleeve of my hoodie, a gesture I had learned from movies, trying to erase my presence, my fingerprints, my sin. I backed out of the room, locked the door, and fled the building, running across the quad with the stolen images burning a hole in my pocket. I didn't go back to Kevin's room. I couldn't. I couldn't look at him with this fresh betrayal on my soul. Instead, I headed straight for the athletic dorms, for the lion's den. The walk was a blur of panic and adrenaline, my mind racing with scenarios of capture and exposure. When I reached Tyrone's door, I didn't knock, I sent him a text. I'm here. The door opened seconds later, pulling me into the musk and heat of his room like a vacuum. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, wearing only a pair of basketball shorts. He looked up at me, his face impassive, devoid of the anxiety that was consuming me alive. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and handed it to him. My hand was shaking so hard the screen wavered in the air. He took it from me, his large fingers engulfing the device, and began to scroll through the images. I watched his face, waiting for relief, for gratitude, for a softening of the hard lines around his mouth. I waited for him to pull me into a hug, to tell me I had saved him, that we were in this together. But there was nothing. He scrolled through the test, nodding slowly as he verified the content, checking the answer key. Then, without looking at me, he forwarded the images to his own phone. The soft whoosh of the sent email was the only sound in the room. He tossed my phone onto the mattress as if it were a piece of trash he was done with. Good, he said simply. That was it. No thank you. No, I love you. No acknowledgement of the risk I had just taken, the felony I had just committed for his sake. He stood up and walked toward me, and I saw the change in his eyes. The rage from earlier in the week was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering hunger that felt even more dangerous. He didn't see a savior standing in front of him, he saw a possession that had finally functioned correctly. You made me wait, he rumbled, stepping into my space, his heat enveloping me. You made me nervous, rich girl. I don't like being nervous. He reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him with a force that was unnecessary and rough. He pushed me backward until my legs hit the edge of the bed, and I collapsed onto the mattress, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Please, Tyrone, I whispered, my voice cracking. I did what you asked. Just let me go. I need to get the keys back. He didn't listen. He didn't care. He climbed over me, his weight pinning me down, trapping me in the prison of his body. You're not going anywhere, he said, his voice a low growl against my neck. You owe me for the stress. You owe me for making me doubt you. What followed was not lovemaking, and it was barely even sex. It was a punishment. It was a claiming. He was rougher than he had ever been, his movements fueled by a mix of relief and aggression. He used my body to work out the tension of the impending exam, treating me with a callous disregard that should have made me scream, should have made me fight him off. But I didn't fight. I lay there, my head turned to the side, staring at the pile of dirty laundry in the corner, and let him take what he wanted. It was not pleasure, but it was a payment, a transaction that balanced the books of our twisted relationship. And in the deepest, darkest recesses of my mind, in a place I was terrified to examine, there was a sick, twisting coil of arousal. Even as he degraded me, even as he used me, I was awed by the sheer, unrepentant force of him. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who took what he wanted without apology, and compared to the paralyzed fear I felt, his absolute certainty was a drug. I hated him in that moment. I hated his sweat dripping onto my skin, I hated his grunt of satisfaction, I hated the way he looked through me. But more than anything, I hated myself. I hated that I had betrayed the kindest person I had ever known for this brute. I hated that I had risked my future for a man who wouldn't walk across the street for me. And I hated that even now, pinned beneath him, feeling the bruise forming on my hip, I was responding to his power with a traitorous, biological submission. When he was finished, he rolled off me and was asleep within minutes, his conscience clear and unburdened. I lay there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the dorm settling, staring at the ceiling. I thought of Kevin, sleeping peacefully in his room, his backpack empty of the keys that would destroy him. I thought of the test that would be distributed in a few hours, the test that Tyrone would now ace with fraudulent brilliance. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the blinds when I finally gathered the strength to move. My body ached, my spirit felt hollowed out, but the survival instinct kicked in again. I dressed in silence, gathered my phone, and slipped out of the room without looking back at the sleeping giant who held my life in his hands. I walked back across the campus in the misty morning light, the birds starting to sing a cheerful song that felt like a mockery. I crept back into Kevin's room, the door opening silently under my hand. He hadn't moved. He was still in the same position, lost in dreams of physics and a future with me. I knelt by his backpack and slid the keys back into the front pocket, zipping it up with a care I hadn't shown earlier. I stripped off my clothes and slid back into bed beside him, shivering as his warmth radiated against my cold skin. I closed my eyes, pretending to sleep, but my mind was a whirlwind of terror and self-loathing. I had returned the keys, but I couldn't return the trust. I had put the weapon back in the holster, but I had already pulled the trigger. And as the sun rose fully, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the room, I knew that while the night was over, the nightmare was just beginning. I hoped it would end here. I hoped Tyrone would get his grade and leave us alone. But as I lay there, listening to the man I loved breathe, I knew with a sickening certainty that secrets like this don't stay buried. They rot, and they spread, and they destroy everything they touch. The following Friday, the results of the final examination were posted on the bulletin board outside the lecture hall, a single sheet of paper that held the fate of dozens of students in its 12-point font. Tyrone's student identification number was near the top of the list, next to a score that was nothing short of miraculous, 98%. It was the highest grade in the class, a statistical anomaly for a student who had struggled to add fractions just weeks prior. The campus erupted in a wave of relieved celebration. The star quarterback was eligible, the season was saved, and the championship dream was alive and kicking. That Saturday, I stood in the bleachers, surrounded by screaming fans painted in the school colors, and watched Tyrone dominate the field with the ferocity of a god of war. He was unstoppable, a kinetic force that plowed through the opposing defense as if they were made of wet paper. Every time he scored, the crowd chanted his name, a rhythmic, thundering roar that shook the concrete beneath my feet. Tyrone. Tyrone. They worshipped him, oblivious to the fraud that fueled his triumph. I clapped along, my hands numb, a plastic smile plastered on my face, feeling like an imposter in a temple of liars. Kevin stood beside me, cheering earnestly, squeezing my hand and shouting about how proud he was that my tutoring had paid off. He looked at me with adoration, believing I was the architect of this miracle, never suspecting I was actually the architect of a crime. But the euphoria of the victory was short-lived, a sugar high that crashed violently on Monday morning. The summons came not via email, but in the form of a student worker interrupting my biochemistry lab, handing me a sealed envelope with the university crest embossed on the flap. I was to report to the dean's office immediately regarding an urgent disciplinary matter. My stomach dropped through the floor, a sensation of weightlessness that made me grip the lab bench for support. I looked at Kevin across the room. He had received a similar envelope. His face was pale, confused, stripped of the joy of the weekend. We walked to the administration building in silence, the crunch of autumn leaves under our feet sounding like breaking bones. The dean's office was a cavernous room paneled in dark walnut, smelling of furniture polish and judgment. Professor Miller was there, sitting in a leather chair, looking grim and disappointed. Tyrone was there too, lounging in a chair in the corner, his legs spread wide, looking bored rather than afraid. And Kevin. Kevin was vibrating with anxiety, his hands twisting together in his lap. I took the remaining seat, feeling the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of an execution chamber. The dean didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid Tyrone's exam paper on the desk, smoothing it out with a hand that trembled with suppressed rage. "We have a problem," the dean said, his voice tight. "Mr. Washington here turned in a remarkable exam. Truly exceptional." He looked at Tyrone, who didn't even blink. "However, there is a peculiarity. You see, in my draft of the answer key, the one I keep in the department safe, I made a specific notation error in the final quadratic equation. A typo. I corrected it in my head during grading, but the written key remained flawed." He tapped the paper. Mr. Washington reproduced that error. He didn't just solve the problem, he replicated a mistake that only existed on a piece of paper locked inside a steel box. The silence that followed was absolute. Kevin looked confused, his brow furrowed as he tried to process the information. Tyrone picked at a piece of lint on his jersey. "The conclusion is obvious," Professor Miller cut in, his voice sharp. "The test was compromised. Someone accessed the safe, photographed the key, and Mr. Washington memorized it blindly." The dean nodded and turned a laptop screen toward us. We pulled the security footage from the night before the exam. At 3:15 in the morning, an individual entered the main office. On the screen, a grainy, black and white figure moved through the shadows. The person was wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low to obscure the face, and black leggings. It could have been anyone. It could have been a man or a woman. But then the figure paused at the door to the inner office. The camera caught a glint of metal as the intruder raised a hand to unlock the door. Dangling from the key ring, unmistakable in the stark light of the hallway, was a plastic molecule keychain, a red and blue model of a water molecule. My heart stopped. It was Kevin's keychain. I had held it in my hand 1,000 times. Kevin stared at the screen, his eyes widening in horror as he recognized his own property. Those are my keys," he whispered, the blood draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. But I wasn't there. I was asleep. I swear to God, I was asleep. He looked at me, pleading for validation, for an alibi. "You know I was asleep, right? You were there." The dean turned his gaze to me. "We know you and Kevin are close," he said, his tone implying that close was a polite euphemism for co-conspirators. "You are also Mr. Washington's tutor. You are the link between the access and the beneficiary." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Kevin denies involvement. Mr. Washington refuses to speak. So we are asking you. Did you see Kevin leave the room? Did he give the keys to someone? Or did he do this himself to help you help your student?" The trap had snapped shut. I looked at Kevin. He was terrified, sweating, a boy who had never broken a rule in his life now facing the destruction of his entire world. He looked at me with total trust, believing that I would tell the truth, that I would explain this misunderstanding. Then I looked at Tyrone. He was watching me with a heavy, hooded gaze. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. He reached into his pocket and tapped his phone against his thigh. Tap. 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 The sound was a deafening reminder of the video he held, the footage of me on my knees, the evidence that would not just expel me, but socially incinerate me. The calculation in my head happened in a split second, cold and binary. If I confessed, I lost everything. My degree, my reputation, my family's respect, gone. Tyrone would release the video out of spite, and I would be the campus slut who stole a test for a jock. If I stayed silent, the evidence of the keys would damn Kevin anyway, but I might be implicated as an accomplice. I needed a third option. I needed a narrative that exonerated me and Tyrone while offering the administration a convenient scapegoat. I started, my voice shaking. I cleared my throat, forcing tears into my eyes. It wasn't hard, I was terrified. I didn't want to say anything. I thought he was just stressed. I looked down at my hands, avoiding Kevin's gaze. Kevin has been under a lot of pressure lately. Financial pressure. The lie tasted like bile, but it flowed smoothly. He has student loans. He mentioned that some of the athletes pay a lot of money for help. What are you saying? Kevin gasped, half rising from his chair. I never said that. What are you talking about? I flinched away from him, playing the part of the heartbroken girlfriend. He told me he could get the keys, I whispered to the dean, crying openly now. He said he could sell the answers to Tyrone and no one would know. I told him not to. I thought he listened to me. I went to sleep. I didn't know he actually went out. The silence in the room changed texture. It shifted from suspicion to judgment. The dean looked at Kevin with a new, hardened expression. The narrative fit perfectly. The underpaid, stressed TA selling access to the wealthy, desperate athlete. It was a story the administration could understand, a story that wrapped everything up in a neat little bow. That's a lie. Kevin screamed, his voice cracking. She's lying. Why are you doing this? He reached for me, but Professor Miller stood up and blocked him. Sit down, son, Miller said, his voice filled with disgust. You've done enough. Kevin collapsed back into his chair, looking at me as if I had just stabbed him in the chest. The light in his eyes, that intelligence and warmth I had loved, flickered and went out. He saw me then. He saw the stranger behind the mask. He realized that the girl he loved didn't exist. The meeting wrapped up with brutal efficiency. The evidence against Kevin, the keys, the video, and now my testimony, was overwhelming. He was suspended immediately, pending a formal expulsion hearing that was a mere formality. He was stripped of his assistantship, his stipend, and his dignity. He was escorted out of the building by campus security, sobbing, a broken figure who had lost his future because he made the mistake of trusting me. Tyrone, on the other hand, received a different kind of justice. With Kevin painted as the mastermind and thief, Tyrone was merely the customer. He admitted to buying study materials from an anonymous source, claiming he didn't know they were stolen. It was an honor code violation, yes, but not a crime. The university, desperate to keep their star player for the playoffs, handed him a one-game suspension and mandatory ethics counseling. He walked out of the office a free man, his scholarship intact, his secret safe. That evening, the sky turned a bruised purple as a storm rolled in from the coast. I stood at the window of my dorm room, looking down at the parking lot. I saw Kevin. He was loading his boxes into the back of a taxi, his movements slow and heavy, like an old man. He paused before getting in, looking up at the building, scanning the windows. I stepped back into the shadows, unable to meet his gaze even from a distance. I watched the taillights of the taxi fade into the rain, carrying away the last pieces of my conscience. I was alone in the room, the silence pressing against my ears. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of anything resembling a soul. I had survived. I had won. But the victory felt like a mouthful of ashes. I had destroyed a good man to save a monster, and in doing so, I had become something worse than both of them. I was safe, yes, but I was also trapped in a prison of my own making, built from lies and betrayal. The door to my room opened. There was no knock, no request for permission. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was by the shift in the air pressure, by the smell of rain and expensive cologne and musk that suddenly filled the small space. I heard the heavy click of the lock turning, sealing us in. Tyrone walked up behind me, his presence a wall of heat against my back. He didn't speak. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He reached out and placed his large, heavy hands on my waist, pulling me back against his chest. It was a possessive gesture, the claim of an owner on his property. He rested his chin on my shoulder, looking out at the same empty parking lot where Kevin had just vanished. I saw a reflection in the dark glass of the window, the massive, dark predator and the pale, treacherous girl caught in his grip. "You did good, genius," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my spine. "Real good." He moved one hand up to my throat, his thumb resting on my pulse, feeling the frantic, terrified rhythm of my heart. He chuckled, a dark sound that promised everything and nothing. "Now we don't have to hide anymore. You belong to the game now." I didn't pull away. I didn't fight him. I leaned back into his touch, closing my eyes against the image in the window. I realized then that the girl who loved poetry and physics had left in that taxi with Kevin. The woman who remained was a creature of survival, a woman who had tasted the dark, raw power of the world and decided she couldn't live without it. I had traded love for sensation, respect for dominance, and decency for survival. As his hands began to move, rough and demanding, I accepted my fate. I was bound to him now, not by love, but by the terrible, unbreakable gravity of our shared sin. I was his prize, his accomplice, his toy. And as the rain lashed against the glass, drowning out the world outside, I surrendered to the darkness I had chosen, knowing that I would never, ever be clean again.